Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video. So today I'm going to do a video about Oasis, specifically about the Oasis Drummer job, which is currently up for grabs, so I understand. I'm probably taking a risk making this video on a couple of levels. First of all, whenever I make a video about drummers or drumming, nobody ever watches it. I don't know why that is, it's just one of those things. I tend to find in general music listeners, music fans don't tend to be that interested in drums or drummers. I found that for many years as a drummer myself, playing in various bands. You know, I was always the last person that anybody talked to after a gig. In fact, it was always drummers who used to come over and talk to me after gigs. Nobody else would ever actually bother. Having said that, when you actually go on YouTube and look at videos about drummers, they do tend to get an awful lot of views. So, but it's just, I don't know, maybe it's just on my channel, people are not interested. But anyway, we'll see. The other thing that I'm taking a risk with this is just, you know, talking about Oasis. I mean, they're such a huge band, and anything I say, you know, could be taken the wrong way. I could get a load of abuse, you know, we'll see. I'll try and be as even-handed as I can. So first of all, just to explain why I thought this would be an interesting video to make. So Oasis have announced this huge reunion, but the lineup has not been confirmed, apart from, I think Bonehead is due to appear. There's been lots of conjecture in the media about which drummer is going to be in the band. Alan White, who was the second drummer, caused a bit of a stir a couple of weeks ago, shortly after the reunion actually was announced, and maybe it was a bit longer ago than that. He posted something to his, I think it was his YouTube channel or Instagram account, a photograph of his old Oasis bass drum with the Union Jack drum skin, and that made everybody think, ooh, Alan's coming back. But he hasn't come forward to confirm that or otherwise. There's been a bit of a wall of silence. I thought I'd better make this video essentially before the announcement comes, you know, as it inevitably will. I have some thoughts about it. I have some thoughts about who is most likely to get the job, and I've also got some thoughts about the guys who were in the band originally. You know, all the drummers. There's four drummers I'm going to look at, and I thought it'd be interesting for me to just, you know, explain what I think about them, and then, you know, get some feedback from you. So let us just see who the contenders are. Now, there's a couple of drummers that I'm not going to include in the list. One of them is Terry Kirkbride, who has played with Oasis on occasion live, and I think he's played with Noel Gallagher, High Flying Birds as well, because he was just a very occasional guy. I'm also not going to include Steve White, the brother of Alan White, who was the Paul Weller's drummer for years, and he stood in for his brother Alan. At least, I think it was one tour he did, or a few gigs he did, and so I'm not going to include him because he was a stand-in. So the drummers I'm going to look at and consider are Tony McCarroll, who was the original drummer, who played with the band from 1991 to 1995, Alan White, 95 to 2004, Zach Starkey, 2004 to 2008, and Chris Sharrock, 2008-2009. So Tony McCarroll, the original drummer, founder member of the band, and he was famously sacked by Noel Gallagher in 1995, just when the single Some Might Say came out. He was replaced with Alan White, who appeared doing Top of the Pops on that song. And Tony, there was some sort of interpersonal problems going on in the band, I think specifically between Tony McCarroll and Noel Gallagher, and I think he'd rubbed Noel up the wrong way, and, you know, various things have been said, various things have been written. Tony has written his autobiography, which is a really nice little book actually, which I have read. Things were said about Tony's drumming, the fact that, you know, he was an untutored drummer, and I think Noel Gallagher made some allegations that, you know, Tony had some mechanical problems with his coordination and that kind of thing. I've got no idea about that. I'm not going to pass comment on that. All I will say was that Tony's drumming was really basic, and that's not a bad thing. There are some great basic drummers out there, you know. I mean, basic is quite a loaded term, actually. What do you understand by basic? You know, it kind of goes back to that Ringo Starr, Charlie Watts thing again, you know, the minimalist thing. But I think Tony was quite untutored, and he had a great sort of trashy kind of style. I should just say, in order to make this video, I've watched various performances, and I'll specify what those are now. So for Tony McCarroll, I watched Glastonbury 1994, which was a very early big show that the band did. I also watched the Live by the Sea at Southend Cliffs Pavilion gig from 1995. So those are the two main performances I looked at for Tony. And in both of them, he's fine, you know, he plays for the song, he's got a very simple style, but he's got a good attitude, you know, the way he sits behind the kit, he looks like a guy that means business, and I think he probably was, well, he almost certainly was the right drummer for the band in those early days. He has lots of fans still, fans of definitely maybe the original Oasis album. To this day will say, you know, Tony was the right man for that album. His style totally meshed with that kind of grinding, primitive guitar sound that Bonehead and Noel had, and it just seemed to fuse and just make this great kind of garage rock kind of sound. So I absolutely think he was the right man for the job. Was Noel right to get rid of him? I'd say probably yes, given the kind of songs that Noel was writing. I think Noel has said, you know, I think at that point he'd written Champagne Supernova and a couple of other songs, and I think he knew that Tony was going to struggle to play those songs to the standard that Noel was going to require. So I think, you know, apart from all the personal stuff that was going down, I think probably it was the right move. It pains me to say it because I just hate the idea of drummers being sacked. As a drummer myself, it's just, you know, so awful. I should just say, actually, you know, Noel Gallagher seems to struggle with drummers. He struggles to keep them. I've got a suspicion that he doesn't value them very much. You know, you think of all the great drummers in all the bands through the years, you know, Keith Moon in The Who, Ringo in the Beatles, Charlie Watts in the Stones, John Bonham in Led Zeppelin, you know. These guys were all totally intrinsic to the bands they were in. But for some reason, in Oasis, that has never been the case. The drummer, it's more like a Spinal Tap kind of situation. It's never seemed to me like Noel was particularly into drummers. He kind of knew what he wanted at each point of their career, and he was quite clear about what he didn't want, but he never seemed that bothered about keeping hold of any of them. That might just be a coincidence, or it might just be that he's got a bit of a thing about drummers. I mean, you know, he's made some sarcastic remarks over the years about drummers are just people who hit things, and he doesn't seem to have a particularly kind of high regard for the art form of drumming. Having said that, that could just be Noel being facetious. Anyway, big diversion. Yeah, I think he was probably right to ask Tony to go, or tell Tony to go. So Tony is let go in 1995, just as the band are peaking, really. Alan White is brought in. His first appearance with the band is on Top of the Pops, doing Some Might Say in 1995. And Alan's an interesting one because he was the brother of Steve White, who is an amazing drummer, really accomplished drummer, who'd played with the Style Council. And Alan had learned the drums, you know, using his brother as an example, really. He sort of, you know, looked up to his brother. But Alan was very tutored, I think, as a drummer. He'd had drum lessons. He'd learned a few tricks, and musically, a bit like Steve, I suppose, Alan was maybe not on the same page as the Gallagher brothers. He was much more into kind of classic soul. He was into James Brown, and you know, he was really keen when they got him into the band. I think he'd been doing some work with you know, he'd been on the acid jazz circuit in London. I think he might have even played with Galliano. He'd done a couple of tours playing acid jazz, and he later said that he was a big fan of that music, and instinctively he had a kind of lighter touch, a totally different sensibility from Tony McCarroll. And you can see that. I remember being very impressed with him, actually, when he did Wonderwall on Top of the Pops. I remember watching that and just thinking, wow, this guy's really good, really interesting. Because I hadn't paid a huge amount of attention to Oasis at that point. Obviously, I was aware of them. I quite liked the early singles, and I was aware that they had this kind of dirty, trashy aesthetic. But Alan's fills on Wonderwall are really wonderful, you know, really wonderful rolling jazz style. I think he was into jazz. And but I think he did sort of hold his own when he sort of came into the band. Obviously, he had to play in a much heavier style. The two performances I've watched for Alan are the Main Road Manchester gig from 1996, which I used to have on VHS tape actually back in the day. And you can see in that he's really going for it. He's kind of doing the he's doing the heavy stuff okay. He looks a bit nervous, I think. If you watch him in the year 2000, the Wembley show, he's clearly come a long way since then. He's got a much more confident demeanour behind the drums, and you know, he really looks like he knows what he's doing. Having said that, I think Alan, the issue that Alan had always with Oasis was that his style just wasn't quite right. The producer of What's the Story, Morning Glory, his name escapes me now, I can't remember, but he always said that he loved working with Alan as a person. He really liked him as a person, but he never thought he was right for Oasis. And one of the reasons for that is that he was fond of doing these ghost notes and shuffling on the drums, and Alan did have a tendency to do that, and as time went on he seemed to do it more and more. He seemed to, even in songs, songs that really needed a very sort of direct, almost like a sort of Phil Rudd approach, a song like Rock and Roll Star. There's one performance of that, I think it was on the Later with Jules Holland show, where he just keeps doing all these ghost notes and he's rolling all the time, and he's clearly trying to be a kind of jazzy, funky player, and it just doesn't quite work sometimes, I think. Now, I've no idea if that's the reason why Alan was finally let go. Alan stayed in the band. He was the longest serving drummer. He was there from 95 to 2004, played on What's the Story, Morning Glory, Be Here Now, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants, and Heathen Chemistry. So he was there for a long time. I saw him play, actually. I saw Oasis playing at Hull Ice Hockey Arena, and it would have been not long before Alan left the band, and it seemed to me at the time that they seemed a bit tired as a band. They seemed like they needed a bit of a kick up the arse, and I do wonder whether Alan had maybe lost a bit of interest. I don't know the story about why he was let go. There's various stories about that, but famously he was replaced in 2004 by Zach Starkey, son of Ringo Starr. This might have been because Noel just fancied having the son of Ringo Starr in the band. I don't know about that. Clearly Zach Starkey was a bit of a superstar drummer in a way. He played with The Who already. He'd done... actually, I saw him play with... He was in Johnny Marr's band in the early noughties. I think he'd done a stint with the Lightning Seeds, maybe. Anyway, they brought Zach Starkey in. Now, I've seen a few performances with Zach. There's a fantastic one. He performed with Oasis at the Brit Awards in 2007, doing Rock and Roll Star, and that is a fantastic performance, particularly at the end when it goes into all the fast rolls at the end. I think he really shone. I also watched him in... What was the other show I watched for Zach? Just that, I think that was the main one. He played Glastonbury with them as well. Zach Starkey is a great drummer. And I think unlike Alan White, he came more from that kind of rock school. He was brought up, I mean, he was clearly Ringo Starr's son, but apparently musically, it was Keith Moon that brought him up. Ringo was often an absent father, I think, and for some reason Keith Moon was always hanging around at the Starkey household. And Zach Starkey grew up not being a Beatles fan, he was a Keith Moon fan. And you can kind of see that in his playing. He did a fantastic job with The Who. If you watch the 9/11 show that was done in New York after the event, absolutely brilliant. And I think he was great with Oasis. He seemed to have quite a lot of attitude and swagger, and I think he injected something into the band. He played on 2 albums, Don't Believe the Truth, I think, and Dig Out Your Soul, and you can hear the difference from the previous Alan White album, which I think was Heathen Chemistry, where Alan was being toned down in the mix more and more, and he was always doing these shuffling break beats. All of a sudden Zach comes in and he just seems to really give the band a push. Much more direct, much more straightforward, much more, more pizzazz, maybe a bit less of a tutored approach. I always thought that Alan White looked like he was always practicing his moves in some way, whereas Zach Starkey came in with more of a kind of rock and roll attitude, I think. Now, he left the band in 2008, apparently after falling out with Noel Gallagher. I don't know the story. And then for the last couple of years of the band's career, they got this guy in, Chris Sharrock, who'd played in Robbie Williams' band. He'd been in the Lars. He played with the Lightning Seeds and World Party. I don't think Chris actually ever ended up playing on an Oasis album because he came in right at the end. He did actually end up then joining Beady Eye with Liam Gallagher, and then he went on to play in the High Flying Birds with Noel. Now, Chris Sharrock, I watched live at Wembley 2008, and I must say he blew me away. He did genuinely blow me away. What's interesting about Chris is that he seems to sort of roll things back to the Tony McCarroll. He's like a real super pumped, virtuosic version of Tony McCarroll, and there's something about the way he kind of crouches at the drum kit. Alan White was always like sort of on a throne. He was always sort of sat back, you know, doing all these nice kind of moves. And Chris, a bit more like Starkey, but more so. Chris he sort of hunches at the kit and he bears down on the drums, and he's got this real kind of intensity about him, this real emotional intensity. He's kind of part of the music. And he really drives the band, really drives it hard. His tempos are up, you know, much, much faster, I think, than the Alan White incarnation. And he just seemed totally on the page with the Gallagher brothers, totally just exuding this air of being the right man for the job, essentially. And that is the surprising revelation that I came to. I think of all the Oasis drummers, I actually think Chris was the best, even though he didn't play on any of the albums. I think his style and his attitude, I think, was exactly what Oasis needed in a way. I'm not going to run Alan White down. I think he did some great work over the years with Oasis, you know, Wonderwall and Champagne Supernova. He was the right drummer at the time, I think. I think it's a shame for Chris that he came in right at the end. I think he deserved more years with the band, really. And I do think my own personal view is that he was the best Oasis drummer. And I think out of all of them, which one's coming back, I think my money would be on Chris for the simple reason that he still plays with Noel Gallagher now. He was in the band when they broke up. He was the one that, apart from Tony, had the least amount of time in the band. Personally, I'd be very surprised if Noel decided not to ask Chris to do it. I can't see him going back and asking Starkey. I can't see the Alan White thing unless they decide to play the nostalgia card and go with the, you know, just the huge nostalgia that's still attached to What's the Story, Morning Glory, and those early huge shows like Nebworth and Lot Lomond. You know, I mean, that was a grand time for Oasis. They were absolutely on top of the world. But I don't think Noel Gallagher is a nostalgic person necessarily. So I don't know. I think my money would be on Chris Sharrock as being the guy that's going to come back, but we'll see. I've no idea when the announcement's going to be, but if it turns out I'm wrong, then so be it. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what you think. Which Oasis drummer was the best, and which one do you think is coming back? Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.